Ian Bremmer here.
I'm Nicholas Thompson.
Everyone knows, I think, who we are, right? Editor-in-Chief of WIRED magazine, our news group. And we've just done a piece together called Divided We Fail in this month's WIRED magazine. And it is about the coming AI, artificial intelligence, Cold War between the United States and China that we're both very concerned about. We think it doesn't get enough attention, and we fear that if that continues to be the case, we will be at loggerheads with each other.
Absolutely. The story came from a concern and an insight that technology, which Ian and I both thought 10 years ago was going to be a great force for democracy and freedom, seems to have turned and is working in the other direction, and actually seems to be a force that is empowering autocracy. So that was the first step, investigating that history, thinking about that history. Second step was looking at how China has taken advantage of this trend, and also China's policies on artificial intelligence. China is pushing very hard on artificial intelligence, which seems like a centralizing force. So that led us to our policy conclusions.
And you know, the idea, first of all, that the United States actually needs to think of AI as strategically very important, right? And that's very hard for the U.S. to do right now. Number one, because the companies that develop this are very much in the private sector, extremely entrepreneurial, have many employees within their companies that don't want to touch the U.S. government. Think of Google and the pushback against Project Maven, working with the Pentagon, for example, which they pulled out of, even though they're still working with the Chinese government on this Dragonfly project. Then you have the fact that the companies are run by people who have a more libertarian ethos, which is basically keep the government out of my pocket. And to the extent they have political views, most of them are strongly opposed to Trump. So we have that very big challenge. We also have the challenge that right now a lot of these companies are seen as damaging civil society, damaging liberal democracy. So we're not thinking about how to use them to fight against the Chinese. We're thinking about how they're using us to enrich themselves and polarize American society, and that we need to regulate them and fight them, which is, by the way, something Nick and I both are sympathetic to. But while that's going on, we have a Chinese government which is investing like crazy into trying to lead the world in artificial intelligence technology.
And that actually, I should note here, by the way, if you have any questions or comments
Yes.
for either for me or for Ian, please put them in the comments.
For both of us.
For both of us. Someone
Yes.
will pop up an iPad. We will answer your questions. So please offer feedback. What Ian just said reminds me of one of the more interesting moments and themes of the piece. When Ian and I started it a few months ago, or started talking about it, the U.S. had, it seemed like really no national AI policy at all. And so one of the questions was going to be, we have no national AI policy. China has a massive national AI policy. Part of the goal will be to get the U.S.'s attention. That's still partly true, but while we worked on the story, the U.S. started to get together. The Trump administration started to have a national AI policy, but all flowing through the Pentagon, all very much about improving our defense and very much based on a fear of China. And I certainly prefer that to nothing.
No policy.
So we do have a policy, it's just, and it's better than no policy, it's just not exactly the right policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you end up down a road where the United States and China are developing completely separate AI spaces and completely separate internets, completely separate big data repositories and surveillance, then we're in an arms race, and we don't need each other as much, and we want each other to fail. And historically, that's of course what happened between the US and the Soviet Union. It would have big knock-on effects for the global order. It would lead to a greater bifurcation of the global economy, for example, and it would mean that the likelihood of inadvertent escalation, especially if one side was fearful of another's first mover advantage that could lead to real war, or at least some kind of preemption that would be very dangerous, becomes much higher. So one thing that Nick and I both believe we need is a way to try to see if we can move away from the zero-sumness. I mean, the US and China on trade, for example, we have very different views. We clearly think that the Chinese aren't spending enough on American goods, that the Chinese are not giving symmetrical access to the Chinese market. We're pressing them on those things. But the likelihood of a trade war is diminished, that would do a lot of damage to both of our economies, precisely because the economies are fairly integrated, because we have supply chains and American corporations that do business in China, they manufacture there, that we want to sell into the Chinese market. But increasingly in AI, that's not happened. So we'd like to see a policy dialogue that allowed for at least some areas of AI that aren't critical for national security in the United States or China to be areas that could become more like trade over time and less like this Cold War.
So the national AI policy that I would like, and I think that Ian would like, would be two parts. The United States government really pushing AI, figuring out what are the public databases that the government can fund and provide access to. What are the rules we need to come up for how AI can develop? How will we help our economy transition to an economy with lots of job churn caused by AI? How will we integrate artificial intelligence to make our military maximally efficient? Simultaneously, how can we work with China? How can we better integrate with China? Because we're heading to a situation, we use the phrase the new Cold War, where developing countries, other countries, in a way, will kind of have to pick sides. We write about Pakistan and Zimbabwe, two countries that recently basically chose an entire tech stack built by China, from the infrastructure that lays your 5G network all the way up to the surveillance cameras and the AI technology that allows you to identify your citizens and read their lips and figure out what they're saying. And what you don't want is you don't want there to be a complete Chinese technology stack that other governments with national technology policies are selecting, buying into, and siding with. That leads to a lot of not good outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, if China is actually successful at exporting not just infrastructure, but actually a model of a surveillance state, first of all, it's going to be empowering for authoritarianism around the world, which is obviously not in our interests or those of America's liberal democratic allies. And also we end up with much less access to those countries for our own entrepreneurial interests, our corporate interests, our technology companies, which right now are worth more than any other companies in the United States, suddenly don't have access to global markets. And that doesn't just mean China, but it means a whole bunch of other countries around the world, especially because China in the next 10 years is almost certainly likely to be the world's largest economy. Yeah. So it would be heading into a fight against an adversary that would actually be pretty compelling, pretty strong, using technologies in their favor to support their political and economic system.
And Ian mentions a theme that's really important there, which is that one of the things about AI is that it does, by its nature, centralize and does sort of give more power to central organizations, whether they're large technology companies or whether they're governments with smart AI policies. One of the reasons for that is that a lot of AI technology, particularly machine learning, though not other things like adversarial networks, but like a lot of AI technology depends on access to mass quantities of data, which obviously are the kinds of things that only large companies and states will have. So there's a centralizing force of AI technology. It's not an absolute, but there's like kind of a trend. And then secondly, one of the things that AI is really good at is surveillance. Image recognition is one of the elements of AI that has been most successful. I mentioned it a minute ago, but there was just a paper of Chinese researchers who are really figuring out how to do lip reading, which combines a couple of other things that AI is really good at. So it seems like AI, very good for self-driving cars, other things we really like, is really good for surveillance. So if you have a technology that is kind of centralizing at its core and is really good for surveillance and is being mastered by China and is going to give more economic and political power to China, that's not great.
And before we take questions, to take this full circle back to what we started with and why we were both concerned about this. I mean, Nick is focused today more on global technology. I'm focused more on geopolitics. But we both came to this years ago with a belief that increasing technologies around the world and access to those technologies was going to empower individuals and was going to undermine authoritarian states. The idea that North Korea wouldn't be able to maintain a surveillance state because as it got more globalized, as people had access to more information, they would make that totalitarian state crumble. And that the Arab Spring and the colored revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia, the Kyrgyz Republic, that all of this communication revolution was really going to point towards a stronger American model and stronger Western liberal democracies. And that actually what we see happening in technological trends in the last 5 years is exactly what Nick just said. Yeah. It is not about empowering individuals. It's clearly about empowering big corporate institutions and big governments that can compile the data, that have access to the scientists, that can do the surveillance, that are spending money on this computing power, can put it all together and can use that to either sort for maximizing economic gain or can sort to maximize their own political stability despite inequalities. And that is a game that right now is empowering a Chinese authoritarian system and is actually starting to really rip apart the fabric of civil society in our own country here in the United States, but also in Europe. It certainly facilitated the Brazilian elections with Bolsonaro. We see this happening all over the world. So we really believe that this is an issue that needs to be addressed, and we want this to be the starting off point of a significant debate, not saying that we think we have all of the policy outcomes that are sort of written in these pages, but we do really think this debate has to happen.
Right. I should mention, this is the article.
Yes.
This is the issue. Pick it up in a newsstand, subscribe. You can read it online at wired.com. So Ian and I started talking about this in 2009, I think.
Yes.
Right. I remember I was at Wired. It was before I went to the New Yorker, and we were talking about the Arab Spring and the question of whether technology was helping Democrats or helping the states. And one of the interesting things about reporting this piece is I went back and I called, Ian and I talked with Wael Ghonim, and he was one of the organizers of the Tahrir Square protests. Yep. And he has this amazing arc, which I think is probably the best way to illustrate this point. So he's a young man. He sees a video of somebody stepping on an image of Mubarak. He realizes that could never exist in Egyptian newspapers, sees the power of the internet to challenge authoritarian states. He goes and he works for Google. At the time of Tahrir Square, at the time, I guess, probably as the uprising starts in Tunisia, he has created a Facebook page, We Are All Khael Sayed, about a young man who's beaten by the Egyptian police. He secretly started that. He gets arrested, sort of accidentally. He gets freed. He becomes an icon. He's one of the people who's up there organizing everybody as Tahrir Square convulses and Mubarak is brought down. And so that's the apex. That's the moment where you think, well, look what Facebook did. Got all these people together and brought down this government that nobody thought could be brought down. Well, what happens after that? We talked to Wael about that, and he says, well, after we brought down the government, it seemed like social media was just radicalizing people on the edges. It was just radicalizing people on the extremes. And so that led to chaos and the inability of the Egyptian protesters to form a coherent state. And so Wael then stops, and he says, okay, I'm going to do distance education. And he does that during the Muslim Brotherhood while they're taking power. And then Sisi comes back and he leaves. So then he comes to the United States and tries to build a social network that facilitates positive, smart conversations as opposed to outrage, and it fails. And he gets absorbed by Quora. And it's kind of the perfect arc of the man who has every single right ideal, is as smart as they can be, is trying as best as he can to make the internet a force to improve liberal democracy, civic conversations, all things that are good and right, and is seeing it go up in flames around him. And so his story is a small part, but an essential part of what we've just written.
And related to that, and this is when it started to become obvious to me that we had a problem, was after the war in Syria started. And within 6 months, the Russians had sent a number of computer-savvy types, a few hundred apparently, to Syria to work with Assad's military and help him identify people inside Syria, moderates that were using social media and texting in ways that would be oppositional to the regime. And months later, they had found them, they round them up, they intimidated them. In some cases, they imprisoned them and even killed them. And then there wasn't a rebel problem from the moderates anymore. And so if you were Hillary Clinton, you were John McCain, you no longer had anyone to say that the Americans should be working with on the ground. It was ISIS or al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, or it was Assad. So very different than what Wael Ghonim was trying to accomplish, did accomplish in Egypt. We got some questions here. Let's throw it. We got Fergus McCullough saying, is there any way that the West can catch up with China on AI? Why don't you take that?
Well, it's actually, you can break it down into all kinds of different elements, and what do you mean by AI? So if you mean national commitment to AI, and how much is the government investing in AI, then it would take a lot for the U.S. to catch up. I mean, China's made this I don't know if it's a number 1 priority, but it's a very top priority. For the U.S., it's a number 1,000 priority, right? So a vastly different executive office. If you're talking about academic research, the U.S. probably has a lead. If you're talking about what do companies what are the company's powers in AI? Probably, overall, the AI technology being advanced by Google, Facebook, Amazon exceeds, that being created by Baidu, Alibaba, WeChat. But if you go down a couple levels and you say, where are the majority of the top younger researchers who will build AI in the future, I think China would be doing pretty well there. If you look at how is AI being integrated in the military, probably the US has more just because our military is so much vaster, but China, again, has probably made it a higher percentage of their military operations. So does China have a lead? Does the US have a lead? I don't know. But is China running faster? Yes, absolutely.
If you look at where AI is being integrated into infrastructure at scale, that's clearly China.
Right.
If you look at who has most of the data right now, that's clearly China. If you look at who is vulnerable to cyber attack from another country in terms of AI, China's more vulnerable because they've got everything on 2 platforms. Yes. And if the US government were to use cyber attacks to shut it down, China would be in a lot more trouble than the Americans would be vulnerable to the Chinese. So that's kind of interesting.
That's a good question.
Let's see.
Good question.
Yeah, that was a good question.
If you have more questions, fire them away in the comments and we'll respond as best we can.
Here's a good question. Wesley Rose says, but does Amazon and Google and others actually represent the United States of America? Because these are not patriotic companies. Right, they represent their shareholders, right?
They represent their shareholders. They have operations in many, many different countries. I mean, this is a question that I've asked executives of these companies at various times in various conversations, and the answer is hard. They all feel some obligation to the U.S. They know that they are citizens. They were born here. And I'm talking about Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, Twitter, Instagram. Like, all of the executives were born in the United States. They're educated here. And they know that there's something about the U.S. system that helped create their companies, that helped create the talent and the innovation, and there's something about the educational system and the way it works. But they don't feel beholden to the U.S. government in a way, certainly not the way the Chinese leaders do, where they have obligations, but probably not even in the way that industry leaders did 20 years ago in the United States.
Or they do in Japan today, for example.
Or they do in Japan. And part of that is Trump, right? So many people, the people who lead the U.S. tech sector are so oppositional to Trump that there's a chasm that's breaking. And actually, one thing I worry about, as a slight side note, is that because there's so much opposition to Trump, that is being translated into opposition to the U.S. government, both at the top and at the lower levels of these companies, and that the ill effects of that will last long after Trump is gone. But in general, I do think the companies feel like they have some obligation to the U.S., that they are U.S. companies, but it's not remotely like China. Good question.
I would also say that 2 points that make me a little concerned about this issue. One is that a lot of the CEOs of these tech companies are themselves techno-utopians. They want to put their money not so much into, sort of inner cities in the United States, but into getting to Mars and into saving the planet and all this stuff. And so as a consequence, their level of interest in engaging with Washington, I would say, is considerably less than those of, let's say, major industrialists in the 1960s or the 1980s, right? The second point is I've had conversations with technologists at the levels that Nick and I are talking about right now, and talked about where I think sort of political inequality is going, our inability to address it, what needs to be done. And I feel like they're really jazzed by the conversation. And then I've had a number of them afterwards not come to me say, what do I need to do about it, or here's some ideas, and instead saying, wow, you convinced me that I really need to buy a house in New Zealand for my kids. And there is this sense that very wealthy, empowered people, when they fear that society is starting to come apart, they're going to do what's good for them as opposed to necessarily looking at what's good for everyone else. And the fact that so many of the major executives of these companies in Silicon Valley have ensured that their children don't have access to screens because they clearly know it's bad for them and addictive, but they're not really but they're still going to work every day in these companies. I mean, that's something that Nick and I are very concerned about, right? Yeah. So let's take one more before we wrap up.
No, let's take like 10 more. These are great.
Do we have time? Can we do that? My guys say one.
We'll
take
you
two
go
more.
have lunch. I'm going to keep answering these questions.
Yeah, okay.
All right. Matthew Taylor. People like Yuval Noah Harari talk about how 21st century AI, big data are far more conductive to authoritarian centralized regimes also. Yes. How can technological developments and innovations in these areas be used to bolster individual liberties and democratic governments while not ensuring the U.S. West don't lose the budding Cold War? Big question, hard question. I'd say one thing that's important, and it's something that Harari talks about, is privacy. And by that I mean, as we move into a future of AI, the amount of data about us and the capacity for governments to manipulate us will go up dramatically. He has a great example in his new book about you now have the capacity to look at somebody's eyes and see how they're dilating. And you could use that technology to see who they're attracted to. And so you could see whether somebody's attracted to men or to women. And so Harari, who is out and openly gay, says that he didn't know that until he was maybe his 20s or late teen years. But probably somebody with modern technology could have figured that out about him. And then could have started using advertisements or started advertising the Wheaties box with the shirtless man, right? Not the woman in the bikini. And that kind of manipulation is going to be massively possible. And so one way to stop that or to limit that is to give control over privacy, give control over data, give understanding about all this back to people. So that's a way of answering one small segment of that very big question.
Yeah, I mean, we know, historically, you talk about advertising and say it works in 50% of the time, you just don't know what 50%, right? But what AI does, it really allows you to tailor your advertisements to individuals in a way that was never before thought possible. Now, if you combine that with the fact that human beings have brains that are extremely fungible, right? Neuroplasticity, that like if we are hit with messages or put in a context, our brains will change. It's why we develop care for our captors, for example, the Stockholm syndrome, when we're sort of kept as hostages. The impact that will have, meaning that not only would an AI target allow someone that was sort of gay to find out about that earlier, but also would be changing people in ways that they would not have been historically. And so would they choose that path themselves? The answer increasingly is no. The path is being chosen by the people that are trying to use them as the product. So I really think that this fundamentally needs to be addressed, but it needs to be addressed at the same time that the Chinese have none of these concerns and they have the other model. This would be so much easier to do if the United States had the only model, right? If we were, in other words, saying, okay, let's take the time, let's have a breath and fix this, and we aren't there yet.
I'm going to just throw in that China does have some concerns about privacy. There are some privacy regulations
coming
in China.
Yes,
I do not want your China staffers to get in trouble here, Ian. All right, one other question which is firmly in your domain. Damian Jacobs, Eric Halen, Cold War between U.S. and China is the dream of Russia, question mark.
And the answer is maybe long-term but not short-term, because in the near term, Putin and the Kremlin are so agitated and aggravated about the United States and about the fact that the U.S. has basically taken their winning of the Cold War and stuffed their face into it, that they are working closely with the Chinese. That's particularly true with sanctions from the U.S. and Europe, the fallout on Ukraine, sort of the ultimatums around Assad and Syria. In the near term, next 5 years, I think the Russia-China relationship is going to be strong, even though long term, the Russians have very serious problems from a fast-growing Chinese economy that will dominate the economies around them and will have technology to empower too. Putin understands this. He says whoever controls AI will control the world, so does Elon Musk, and yet Putin has no chance of controlling AI. It's a pretty difficult question.
Difficult question.
Good stuff.
All right, so this is the story. Please read it. Please share it. Please tag your congresspeople when you share it, because I would really like Washington to start caring and thinking about this issue instead of all the other stuff they're talking about right now. Wired.com. We've both tweeted, shared it, and shared it on all of our millions platforms. We are good to go. Thank you for your questions.
Thanks. See you guys soon. Bye.